One of the most prominent Republican lawmakers passed away last night at the age of 71. Initial findings show Graham died from an aorta rupture connected to hardening of the arteries.
On screen, they were the warmest family in America. 7 children, 2 parents, and a house full of grandparents who never seemed to run out of love. Off-screen, that same house was quietly losing people, one by one, to illness, ambition, and choices that had nothing to do with the story being told. The Waltons ran for 9 seasons, and by the time the porch light dimmed on Walton's Mountain for the final time, almost none of the original cast that had opened the show in 1972 was still there in the way audiences remembered them. This is the story of why they really left, not the sanitized version handed to TV Guide in the 1970s, but the fuller picture that has come out over decades of interviews, biographies, and the honest reflections of the people who lived it. To understand why the departures mattered so much, you have to understand what the Waltons actually was to its audience. Created by Earl Hamner Jr., who based the show loosely on his own Depression-era childhood in rural Virginia, the series premiered on CBS in September 1972 at a moment when American television was dominated by urban sitcoms and crime dramas. The Waltons offered something different, a family surviving hardship together, narrated by an adult John Boy looking back on his youth with tenderness rather than nostalgia for its own sake. Audiences didn't just watch the Walton family. They adopted them, which is exactly why every departure felt less like a cast change and more like a death in the family. The first, and in many ways the most consequential exit, was Richard Thomas, who played John Boy Walton, the eldest son, and the emotional center of the entire series. Thomas won an Emmy for the role in 1973 and became, almost overnight, the face of the show. But by 1977, after 5 seasons, he made the decision to leave. The commonly repeated explanation was that Thomas wanted to pursue a film career and feared being permanently typecast as John Boy. That much is true, and Thomas himself has discussed it in interviews over the years, explaining that he felt the character had taken him as far as he could go creatively within the confines of a weekly family drama. But there was something more personal underneath the professional reasoning. Thomas and his wife at the time, Alma Gonzalez, were expecting triplets, and the physical and emotional demands of a grueling television production schedule became difficult to reconcile with the reality of suddenly becoming a father to 3 children at once. Thomas has spoken about wanting more control over his time and his choices, a common thread among young actors who found themselves defined by a single role before they'd had the chance to explore anything else. His departure was handled respectfully by the writers, who sent John Boy off to New York to pursue a writing career, staying true to the show's own internal logic. Robert Whiteman was brought in to play an older version of the character, but audiences never fully accepted the replacement, and the show, while it continued for 4 more seasons, was never quite the same without Thomas at its emotional core. Not long after, the show lost someone in a far more permanent and devastating way. Will Geer, who played Grandpa Zebulon Walton, had lived an extraordinary life before ever setting foot on Walton's Mountain. He had been blacklisted during the McCarthy era for his political activism, and by the time he joined the Waltons in his late 60s, he had already survived one of the most difficult professional periods any actor of his generation had faced. Geer brought a lived-in wisdom to Grandpa Walton that audiences responded to instantly. But Geer suffered from respiratory illness for years, complications that were reportedly connected to a lifetime of smoking and the physical toll of age. In April 1978, Will Geer died of respiratory failure at the age of 71. His death was not a scripted departure or a career decision. It was simply the end of a life, and it happened while the show was still airing new episodes. The writers made the decision to write Grandpa's death into the storyline itself, allowing the Walton family and the audience watching them to grieve together. It remains one of the most emotionally significant moments in the show's history, precisely because it wasn't fiction pretending to be real. It was real grief, filmed and broadcast, because there was no other honest way to handle it. Around the same period, the show faced another loss that was quieter, but no less serious. Ellen Corby, who played Grandma Esther Walton, suffered a massive stroke in 1976 that left her with significant physical limitations, including difficulty with speech and mobility. For an actor whose entire craft depended on precise delivery and physical presence, a stroke of that severity should have ended her career entirely. Instead, Corby made the decision to return to the show, and the producers made the decision to let her. Rather than write Grandma out, the series incorporated her recovery into the storyline, showing the character undergoing her own stroke and slow rehabilitation. It was an unusually honest choice for network television at the time, and it meant Corby continued appearing on the show in a reduced capacity for several more seasons, her scenes often shorter, and her dialogue carefully written around her real physical condition. Corby's determination to keep working despite her health has been described by colleagues and biographers as remarkable, and it stands as one of the more quietly courageous chapters in the show's production history. She continued acting, in some capacity, until her death in 1999. Then there was Michael Learned, who played Olivia Walton, the matriarch of the family, and, alongside Ralph Waite's John Walton Sr., one of the two adult anchors of the entire series. Learned won 3 Emmy Awards for the role, making her one of the most decorated actresses in the show's history. But by the late 1970s, Learned made the decision to step back from the series, and her reasoning has been discussed by her in interviews conducted over the following decades. She has said that after years of playing the same steady, endlessly patient character, she felt creatively restless and wanted to take on roles with more range and complexity than a weekly family drama could offer. There was also a storyline written specifically to explain her reduced presence. Olivia contracted tuberculosis and was sent to a sanatorium for treatment, a plot device that allowed the writers to scale back Learned's appearances while she pursued other projects, including stage work, which she has spoken about valuing deeply for the creative freedom it offered compared to television. Learned returned periodically for reunion specials and later television movies, showing that her departure, unlike Will Geer's, was never a full severing of ties, but rather a gradual, professionally motivated stepping back that reflected an actor at the height of her career choosing to expand rather than repeat herself. Ralph Waite, who played John Walton Sr., stayed with the series for nearly its entire run, but even his story carries a layer often left out of casual retrospectives. Waite was open in later interviews about struggling with alcohol during parts of his life, including periods that overlapped with his years on the show, and he later became deeply involved in recovery work and even public service, eventually running for Congress in California. His commitment to the Walton family character remained steady, but his own personal battles reveal that the stability audiences saw in John Walton Sr. on screen did not always mirror what the actor was carrying off-screen, a pattern that repeats itself across almost every long-running family drama in television history. The younger cast members, many of whom were children when the series began, experienced their own quieter departures and returns as the show evolved. Judy Norton, who played Mary Ellen, John Walmsley, who played Jason, Mary McDonough, who played Aaron, Eric Scott, who played Ben, David W. Harper, who played Jim Bob, and Cammie Kodeler, who played Elizabeth, all grew up in front of the camera, and their roles naturally shifted as the writers had to account for actors aging in real time while their characters were meant to be growing up on a fixed television timeline. Mary McDonough has spoken in later years, including in her own memoir, about the pressures of growing up as a young actress under public scrutiny, including struggles with body image and self-esteem that she says were intensified by comments about her appearance during her teenage years on the show. Her willingness to discuss this openly decades later added an important and often overlooked dimension to the story of what it actually meant to grow up as part of America's most beloved television family. The warmth audiences felt watching the Waltons did not always extend to how the young actors playing them were treated behind the scenes. By the time the original series ended in 1981, the show had already weathered the departure of its narrative center in Richard Thomas, the death of its grandfather figure in Will Geer, the health crisis of its grandmother figure in Ellen Corby, and the gradual stepping back of its mother figure in Michael Learned. What kept the show going, and what brought audiences back for reunion movies well into the 1990s, was the underlying strength of Earl Hamner Jr.'s original vision and the genuine affection the cast held for one another, an affection that multiple cast members have confirmed extended well beyond the cameras. Richard Thomas has spoken about returning for reunion specials not out of contractual obligation but because of real fondness for the people he'd worked alongside as a young man. Judy Norton and Mary McDonough have both discussed, in various interviews and convention appearances over the years, how the bond formed among the young cast members mirrored something close to an actual family, one that continued checking in on each other long after the cameras stopped rolling. What makes the story of these departures so different from typical Hollywood cast turnover is that almost none of them were driven by the usual reasons: contract disputes, on-set feuds, or bitter falling outs with producers. Instead, the reasons were disarmingly human. An actor wanting to grow beyond a role that had defined his 20s. A man's body finally giving out after a long and difficult life. A woman refusing to let a stroke end a career she'd fought to build. A performer choosing artistic range over comfortable repetition. These were not scandals. They were simply life, happening to people who, for a few hours a week, had convinced millions of viewers that they were a single unbroken family living on a mountain in Virginia during the hardest years of the 20th century. Perhaps that's why the departures still resonate with audiences decades later, in a way that cast changes on other shows rarely do. The Waltons was never really about plot twists or dramatic reveals. It was about the slow, steady work of loving people through hardship and watching that same theme play out in the real lives of the actors, through illness, grief, ambition, and growth, only deepen the connection between the show and the people who watched it. When Richard Thomas left, viewers grieved the loss of John Boy's voice guiding them through each episode. When Will Geer died, they grieved a man who had genuinely become part of their weekly lives. When Ellen Corby returned after her stroke, they didn't see a diminished performance. They saw the same courage the Walton family was always meant to represent, now made real by the woman playing her. In the end, the story of why these actors left the Waltons isn't really a story about an ending at all. It's a story about how a television family, built on the fictional struggles of the Great Depression, ended up living out its own very real struggles in parallel, and how the people who created that family chose, again and again, to meet those struggles with honesty rather than convenient rewrites. Richard Thomas grew into the film and stage career he'd hoped for, eventually returning to television decades later with the same warmth audiences remembered. Michael Earned went on to a long and celebrated career on stage and screen, carrying 3 Emmys and the quiet satisfaction of an actress who never stopped reaching for new roles.